All right, hello. Now, today is September 22nd, and as you can see, the sun is at 29 degrees of Virgo, and we're about to have the fall equinox as the sun moves into Libra. Um, my last astrology video I did, I was kind of talking about some of my own personal stuff that I'm dealing with around all these transits. And since I recorded that video, there's just been a lot of stuff going on in the news. And although I used to have a Facebook group called Current Events Astrology, I decided to pause that group. And subsequently, Canadians can't really post any news items on Facebook anymore. So I think I picked a good time to just wind that particular project down. And I have been kind of thinking about also just staying away from talking about politics or about different. I mean, one thing I'm not a journalist, right? So I'm not trying to approach this from the point of view of having any insight into what is true and false and what I'm not going to be, but curious about the astrology, right? But just to briefly go over some of the things that have been going on, Russell Brand has been canceled for sexual assault stuff. In more local news, the leader of the Sikh community, um, Sikhs are a certain religious denomination they're not Muslim, they're not Hindu, but they're from India, and there's a lot of Sikh people who've immigrated in my neighborhood from India because there's I'm not an expert on all this, but there are some tensions between the Sikh community and the government of India, and there are some Sikh people who want to establish their own separate nation state to break off from India. Again, I'm not a journalist, so I'm not going to give you the best rundown with this. But a Sikh community leader was assassinated, basically, and there's all this tension between the Canadian government and India, and this is just like in my local around where I live that this happened. Um, and then at the same time, there's protests all across Canada around trans issues for people protesting against trans people and then trans people protesting against them. That's in the news right now. And there's also the stuff going around about the residential schools in Canada. So this is, aside from Russell Brand, this is a very Canada centric kind of current events thing. Um, and before I get into the astrology, I was just thinking about like what some of the themes around this, and one of them this that like again I'm not my goal is just to talk about these in terms of astrological archetypes. Um, One of the things, I don't know if it's redundant to say that media spin is part of the equation, but as soon as there's just some stuff coming up where more conservative or right wing news publications in Canada were trying to swing things or trying to spin things in a certain direction along with the indigenous burial sites or whatever. And then I'm just looking at the news now, and there's more news stories coming up where they're verifying some of these sites in BC. But there's something else going on where there was an excavation somewhere, I think in Manitoba, where they didn't find anything, and then certain news outlets are trying to spin this in a direction that it's like, oh, there's nothing there. It was all a bunch of media hype that people are getting angry for nothing, and then there's other media. I mean, if there's, I'm not gonna break it all down in this video, but needless to say, there are certain a lot of these issues are being spun different ways. I've also seen the Russell Brand thing. Um, People are saying, is this like the character assassination, him getting canceled, or there is one thing that I've heard some people talk about is that um, for some reason the victims are anonymous, where usually the victims have to kind of go on record when they make a statement against somebody. And I'm not even really a fan of Russell Brand, or again, I'm not really sure about that politics. I'm not as confidently, maybe as some people putting themselves board that certain style of stuff. Um, And but there's also, I mean, you could also look at other sort of links between this. Is that Russell Brand is a guy who kind of went through this new age recovery kind of thing, like addictions recovery, and kind of rebranded as a kind of a new age spiritual guru. And then if you look at like and he's a guy who you could say is like proverbially has his career assassinated. And then you have a guy who's actually the leader in a certain religious community getting assassinated literally. Um, and then at the same time, obviously, the residential schools is all about the inquiry into all these deaths that were either covered up, or there's like the idea of you know th- students that went missing. There's no record of their death, and there's the kind of what might be secret or covered up, and trying to establish something there, right? But I mean, I guess talking about death as in a broad sense. Um, it's sort of common to some of these things. Also, the religious thing of course, the residential schools. There's the influence of the Catholic Church being, and the basically being a kind of a conversion issue of converting over converting indigenous people, forcing them to be Catholic, or trying to force them into the new culture of a colonial society. And then you have things like the clash of different religious groups or even trans protests could be seen as people who are conservative versus the whole, or people accusing the new politics of being kind of dogmatic in its own way, even if it's the progressive politics is becoming a religion. um, so like but there is that basic kind of qualities there across all these issues. And so now, since I've talked about that a little bit, if you look at the astrology, like I have a way of, like, if I'm going to look at the planets, to look at what aspects are the tightest right now. What are the strongest aspects if you look at the astrology right now? And you can see, first of all, that Pluto is at 27 degrees and Neptune is at 26 degrees. So that's a sextile between Neptune and Pluto with a 1-degree orb. If you look at Venus and Mars are also in a sextile with a 1-degree orb. And so this is interesting because I think, for one thing, Pluto is definitely relevant here with the whole things about like assassinations and secrets coming out, and things revealed or whatever, right? Or the kind of the conspiratorial tone, or even if you think the media is manipulating things, then that could very well be a kind of a Pluto behind what's happening on the other side of the curtain kind of thing. um and then Neptune, I think there's something about the whole play of media, and also not just media, but the mass psyche, like the being sensitive to the whole collective psyche, these kind of issues that kind of might provoke people, or everybody might have some kind of reaction to it. But there's something about this kind of, like, not just a personal issue, but a social issue that involves large groups of people. um, yeah, or it could just be identity politics in general, but I'm thinking there's something about uh the outer planets in general are more collective. I mean, that's not just but the religious spiritual thing about how you have, even with the Russell Brand thing, you have a guy who's become a kind of a new age spiritual guru. You've got a guy who's a leader of a spiritual community. um I also think there's something about Mars in Libra which resonates a lot with this, because it's certain things where you have, like, Libra is kind of like the air sign that's about justice and balance and mediation and stuff, and you've got the god of war kind of in this sign where maybe usually we have a kind of a peaceful agreement, but Mars is kind of messing things up a little bit. And Mars is in this square to Pluto, but it's a 10-degree orb. So this is one of the things that's interesting, is that Mars square to Pluto isn't very strong right now, but it's only going to get stronger as we progress. So these things may. That's one thing that I'm looking at the astrology in, that there's a lot of sextiles, but sextiles are usually seen to be kind of more harmonious. And the Mars square Pluto would be indicative of something that is more inflammatory, or you might see some sort of violent clash or conflict around. Um, there's also Venus is in a square to Jupiter. And, these are the two benefics, though, in a square. And I think Jupiter is often described in a kind of legalistic quality, like kind of having to do with establishing order or a rule of law, or um, the kind of karmic providence, right? That's a kind of a Jupiter thing. Um, and I mean, I think it's also, I mean, to remind you, the last video I did was about Sun opposite Neptune. And so the sun is in an opposition to Neptune. It's just separating from that opposite. And when all this new stuff was happening was probably when that opposition was perfecting. So that I think that's another thing to consider, is that the sun archetypally is associated with the hero or the king or the leader. So I think in the case of somebody like Russel Brand, as well as the Sikh leader who was assassinated, um, you've got the sort of the solar figure, and even and the sort of, there's a sort of spiritual religious, I mean, I'm not saying it's the same thing with Russell Brand and the Sikh leader, um, but it's still that Neptune dynamic is playing out one way or another, right? And you've also got Uranus in on this, and you've got a trine from Uranus to Pluto, although again the orb is not quite as strong right now. Um, the other thing that's going on is that if you progress here, we are going to have a lunar eclipse in Aries, although I don't know, this is probably not going to be I don't know. If you see, the moon is not that far away, that close to the north node, so it may not be like the biggest lunar eclipse ever. Um, but then as we keep going, we have the upcoming solar eclipse in Libra, which Mars was just there for, but now Mars is going to be in Scorpio for this. And that solar eclipse in Libra is going to be in that kind of rough square to Pluto there. Um, and you got exact opposition between Mercury and Chiron on that one too. Anyways, I just thought I would show you this. I just thought I should mention this because there's quite a lot of stuff going on that I think goes with the astrology one way or another. And this is my attempt to at least report on the astrological dynamics, although I may not be, I'm not here to shed light on exactly what's going on. I don't claim to have that kind of level of insight into things, but at least to look at the archetypes, because they definitely seem to be something playing out in the public psyche these days. All right, thank you very much.